In the early spring of 1241, the Kingdom of Hungary stood on the edge of a disaster it could neither fully see nor truly understand. For months, rumors had moved across the eastern plains like distant thunder. Traders spoke of cities burned beyond the Carpathian Mountains. Refugees arrived with stories that sounded too terrible to believe. Entire kingdoms in the east, vast, powerful states that had stood for centuries, had collapsed in a matter of weeks. But in Hungary, the warnings were still treated as exaggerations. The kingdom was large. Its armies were respected. Its fortresses guarded the great river crossings. And its king believed that whatever had destroyed the lands of Rus and Poland would break itself against the strength of Hungary. Yet the force now approaching from the east was unlike anything the kingdoms of Europe had faced before. It was not a migrating horde as many imagined. It was an army operating with extraordinary coordination, discipline, and purpose. And it was already moving through the mountain passes. The Mongol Empire had expanded with astonishing speed during the first decades of the 13th century. What had once been scattered nomadic tribes of the Eurasian steppe had been unified under the leadership of a single figure, Genghis Khan. Under his rule, the Mongols developed a military system that combined speed, organization, and intelligence in ways few enemies understood. Armies moved in carefully structured units. Scouts rode days ahead of the main force. Communication signals carried orders across the battlefield in moments. Every campaign followed a deliberate pattern: reconnaissance, psychological intimidation, rapid movement, and sudden concentrated violence. Cities that resisted were destroyed. Cities that surrendered were spared. Word of this policy spread faster than the armies themselves. By the late 1230s, Mongol forces had already crushed the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, shattered the principalities of Rus, and pushed steadily westward across the steppe. Each victory provided more intelligence, more supplies, and more understanding of the lands beyond. Europe was no longer an unknown frontier. It was the next objective. The western campaign of the Mongols was commanded by a coalition of experienced generals, led by Battle Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, and guided by one of the most brilliant military minds of the era, Subutai. Subutai had spent decades refining Mongol warfare. He believed victory began long before a battle started. Information was the true weapon. Long before the main armies moved, Mongol scouts had already mapped the rivers, plains, and mountain passes of Eastern Europe. They had learned which roads merchants used, which cities controlled bridges, and which kingdoms were divided by internal conflict. The intelligence gathered during these early explorations would shape the entire invasion. The Hungarian Kingdom, in particular, was of strategic importance. Its vast plains provided ideal terrain for mounted armies. But Hungary was also a barrier. Beyond it lay the heartlands of Central Europe. If Hungary fell, the road to Vienna, Prague, and even the German states would stand open. In the winter of 1240, Mongol forces completed the destruction of the powerful city of Kiev. The fall of Kiev sent shockwaves across Eastern Europe. Refugees poured westward into Hungary, bringing news of the devastation. Among these refugees were the Cumans, nomadic warriors who had once dominated the steppe north of the Black Sea. For years, the Cumans had fought the Mongols and lost. Now their leader, Khotan Khan, came to Hungary seeking protection. King Béla IV of Hungary faced a difficult decision. Allowing thousands of Cuman warriors into the kingdom could strengthen his army. But it also risked destabilizing the fragile balance of power within Hungary itself. Many Hungarian nobles deeply distrusted the Cumans. They viewed them as foreign nomads whose loyalty could not be trusted. Yet Béla believed that the coming invasion required every possible ally. He granted the Cumans asylum and demanded that they convert to Christianity as a sign of loyalty. The decision would have profound consequences. Within Hungary, the arrival of the Cumans quickly created tension. The newcomers moved across the plains with their herds and families, often clashing with local populations. Hungarian nobles accused them of raiding villages and stealing livestock. Rumors spread that the Cumans were secretly cooperating with the Mongols. Whether true or not, the suspicion deepened existing divisions inside the kingdom. At the same time, King Béla struggled to unify his own aristocracy. For decades, The Hungarian monarchy had been weakened by powerful regional nobles who guarded their independence fiercely. When Béla attempted to strengthen royal authority, many nobles resisted. Some even refused to bring their full forces when the king called for military preparation. The kingdom that needed unity most was quietly fracturing from within. Meanwhile, the Mongols were already advancing. Their strategy for the invasion of Europe relied on a principle that Subutai had used successfully for years: divide the enemy before they could unite. Instead of a single massive invasion, Mongol forces advanced along several different routes simultaneously. In the north, one army entered Poland, defeating European knights at the Battle of Legnica. This northern campaign served an important purpose. It drew the attention of Western Europe away from Hungary. While Christian forces scrambled to respond in Poland and Silesia, the main Mongol army moved southward through the Carpathian passes toward the Hungarian plain. The Hungarian leadership still believed the mountains would slow the invasion. But Mongol engineers and scouts had already identified multiple routes through the terrain. Small vanguard forces slipped through passes that defenders had barely fortified. The barriers Hungary relied upon were already beginning to crumble. By early March of 1241, the scale of the threat was becoming impossible to ignore. Mongol detachments appeared along the eastern frontier, moving with unsettling speed. Villages burned. Local garrisons disappeared. Survivors described horsemen who attacked without warning and vanished before defenders could respond. King Béla ordered a full mobilization of the Hungarian army. Nobles from across the kingdom were summoned to gather their forces. The royal host began assembling near the great rivers that cut across the Hungarian plain.
These rivers would form natural defensive lines, or so the Hungarian commanders believed. But the Mongols had faced rivers before. Many times. The Hungarian army that gathered in response to the invasion was large by European standards. Estimates vary, but it likely included tens of thousands of soldiers, heavy cavalry knights, infantry levies, crossbowmen, and allied Cuman horsemen. Yet numbers alone did not guarantee success. The army contained factions with competing interests. Some nobles distrusted the Cumans and blamed them for attracting the Mongol invasion. Others questioned the king's leadership. Tension simmered inside the camp even before the enemy appeared, and the Mongols, as always, were watching. Their scouts observed the movement of the Hungarian army from a distance, noting the locations of camps, supply routes, and river crossings. Every detail was carefully reported back to commanders. Subutai was already shaping the battlefield in his mind. He did not intend to simply confront the Hungarian army. He intended to break it. In the days leading up to the decisive encounter, the Hungarian army moved eastward toward the Sajó River. There, near a small settlement called Mohi, they prepared to block the Mongol advance. The Sajó offered a natural defensive barrier. Only a few bridges crossed the river, and Hungarian forces fortified the main crossing. If the Mongols attempted to cross, they would have to attack a well-defended position. The Hungarian commanders believed they had finally forced the enemy into a predictable situation. But predictability was precisely what the Mongols avoided. While Hungarian forces strengthened their positions near the bridge, Mongol reconnaissance continued quietly along the riverbanks. They searched for shallow crossings, hidden fords, and alternative approaches. And eventually, they found exactly what they needed: a crossing point that the Hungarian army had not guarded. The stage for the Battle of Mohi was now set. On one side of the river stood the assembled army of the Hungarian Kingdom, confident that the river shielded them from immediate attack. On the other side waited the Mongol forces, spread across the landscape, studying the terrain and preparing for a maneuver that would unfold in darkness. Subutai understood that a frontal assault against the bridge would draw the Hungarian army's full attention. But the real battle would be decided somewhere else. In silence, under the cover of night, Mongol engineers began preparing something that the Hungarian commanders did not expect. By the time dawn approached on April 11, 1241, the battle that would destroy the Hungarian army had already begun to take shape, and the Hungarian camp still believed the river protected them. The Hungarian army encamped along the western bank of the Sajó River in early April of 1241. Their camp was large, crowded, and heavy with the confidence of men who believed they had finally forced their enemy into a difficult position. The river curved across the plain in a slow arc, forming what seemed like a natural shield. At Mohi, a sturdy wooden bridge crossed the Sajó, one of the few reliable passages across the water. Hungarian commanders believed the Mongols would have no choice but to attack here. If they attempted to cross the bridge, they would face a concentrated defensive force of knights, infantry, and crossbowmen waiting on the opposite bank. Any army attempting such a crossing under attack would suffer terrible losses. The logic seemed sound, but it relied on a dangerous assumption that the Mongols would fight the battle Hungary expected. Across the river, Mongol forces were gathering. Their camp was smaller and far more controlled. Mongol armies were organized with remarkable discipline. Each warrior belonged to a unit with strict hierarchical command, groups of 10, 100, 1,000. Orders moved through these structures with efficiency that European armies rarely matched. The commanders overseeing the invasion of Hungary were among the most experienced leaders in the Mongol world. Béla Khan served as the political head of the campaign. As a grandson of Genghis Khan, his authority carried enormous weight within the Mongol aristocracy. But the true architect of the operation was Subutai. By this point in his life, Subutai had spent decades campaigning across Eurasia. He had fought in China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and the Russian principalities. His victories were not the result of brute force alone, but careful preparation and an almost mathematical understanding of battlefield movement. Subutai rarely fought battles directly in front of an enemy's strongest position. Instead, he created situations where the enemy's strength became a trap. At Mohi, the Hungarian army had placed its confidence in the bridge. Subutai had already decided the bridge would only be part of the battle. The Hungarian force was formidable by European standards. The core of the army consisted of heavily armored knights, noble warriors trained from youth to fight on horseback. Their armor was thick, their weapons powerful, and their charges devastating in open combat. Supporting them were infantry levies from across the kingdom, spearmen, swordsmen, and crossbowmen. Crossbows in particular were considered an effective counter against fast-moving horse archers. Among the Hungarian ranks were also thousands of Cuman warriors, steppe horsemen whose style of warfare resembled that of the Mongols in some ways. They rode light horses and fought with bows, capable of rapid movement across the plains. Yet inside the Hungarian army, cohesion remained fragile. Many nobles distrusted the Cumans, and communication between different contingents of the army was imperfect. Unlike the Mongols, the Hungarian command structure was not unified by strict discipline. Orders traveled slowly, and coordination between different commanders often depended on personal relationships rather than formal systems. In the chaos of a large battlefield, such weaknesses could become fatal. The Mongol army confronting them operated very differently. Most Mongol warriors were mounted archers. Each rider typically controlled several horses, allowing them to rotate mounts and maintain speed over long distances. Their bows were compact composite weapons capable of firing powerful arrows at remarkable range. But their greatest strength was not the weapon itself. It was the system surrounding it. Mongol units could disperse and regroup rapidly. Scouts operated far ahead of the main force, feeding constant information back to commanders. Signals carried across the battlefield through flags, horns, and drums. A Mongol army could appear scattered, even disorganized, until the moment when its units suddenly converged on a precise target. At Mohi, Subutai intended to exploit every weakness in the Hungarian position, and the first step would come during the night. On the evening of April 10th, Mongol forces approached the Sajó River. Hungarian scouts had detected movement on the eastern bank, but nothing suggested a large-scale attack. From the Hungarian perspective, the Mongols appeared cautious, perhaps even hesitant. This was deliberate. Subutai ordered part of the Mongol army to move toward the bridge under the command of Béla Khan. Their task was straightforward: approach the bridge, test defenses, and draw the attention of the Hungarian army. Meanwhile, several miles to the south, another Mongol force began a different operation entirely. Under cover of darkness, engineers and soldiers quietly moved toward a section of the river where the banks were shallow and accessible. Here, they began constructing a temporary bridge. The work was methodical, wood, rope, and portable engineering equipment had traveled with the Mongol army throughout the campaign. Within hours, a functional crossing began to take shape, hidden from the main Hungarian camp by distance and darkness. Subutai had effectively split the battlefield before the battle even began. One Mongol force would attack the Hungarian bridge. Another would cross the river unseen. Before dawn on April 11th, the first signs of conflict appeared. Mongol forces advanced toward the bridge at Mohi, probing the Hungarian defenses. Hungarian guards stationed near the crossing detected movement and quickly raised the alarm. Knights and infantry rushed toward the bridge to reinforce the position. Arrows began to fly across the darkness. The Mongol attack at the bridge was intense but controlled. Mounted archers fired volleys toward the defenders, testing their response and forcing them to commit more troops to the area. Hungarian crossbowmen returned fire from behind defensive positions. The bridge quickly became a focal point of the battle. From the Hungarian perspective, the enemy was behaving exactly as expected. They were attempting to force the crossing. Commanders believed the river barrier was working. What they did not know was that thousands of Mongol cavalry had already begun crossing the river several kilometers away. As dawn approached, Subutai's flanking force completed its crossing. Once across the river, the Mongol cavalry moved rapidly across the plains toward the rear of the Hungarian camp. Their objective was not simply to attack. It was to encircle. The Hungarian army had constructed its camp in a traditional European style, wagons and supply carts arranged into defensive barriers, forming a fortified enclosure. Such wagon forts could protect soldiers from sudden cavalry charges. But they also had a weakness. If the army became trapped inside them with limited exit routes, maneuvering became extremely difficult. Subutai intended to create precisely that situation. Meanwhile, the battle at the bridge intensified. Hungarian knights attempted to push across the crossing in a counterattack, hoping to drive the Mongols away from the riverbank entirely. For a moment, the defenders seemed to gain the upper hand. Mongol units near the bridge pulled back under pressure, giving the impression that the Hungarian assault was working. But this withdrawal was carefully controlled. The Mongols had used feigned retreats for decades. It was one of their most effective tactics. As Hungarian forces pressed forward, Mongol archers continued firing from a distance, gradually drawing the defenders away from their strongest positions. Confusion spread across the battlefield. Visibility was poor in the early morning haze. Orders struggled to move quickly between different parts of the Hungarian army. And then, from the south, new movement appeared. Columns of Mongol cavalry began emerging behind the Hungarian camp. The encirclement had begun. At first, the Hungarian commanders struggled to understand what they were seeing. Reports arrived that enemy forces had appeared on the western bank of the river, behind the main army. This was impossible, or so it seemed. The bridge was still under heavy defense. How had the Mongols crossed? By the time the truth became clear, it was already too late. Subutai's flanking force was now attacking the rear of the Hungarian camp, while Battle army continued pressure at the bridge. The Hungarian army was no longer defending a river crossing. It was fighting on two fronts at once. Inside the wagon fort, soldiers began rushing to reposition themselves. Knights attempted to form organized countercharges. Infantry scrambled to defend gaps in the defensive lines. But the Mongols did not rush the attack. Instead, they surrounded the Hungarian position, and then they began tightening the circle. The real Battle of Mohi was only beginning. As the sun rose higher above the Hungarian plain on the morning of April 11th, 1241, the shape of the battle began to change. At first, the Hungarian army had responded with determination. Knights formed defensive lines near the wagon camp. Infantry clustered behind makeshift barricades. Crossbowmen attempted to slow the Mongol advance with steady volleys. But the battlefield around Mohi was no longer a simple confrontation between two armies. It had become a tightening enclosure. From the east, Battle Khan's forces continued pressing the bridge crossing. From the south and west, Subutai's cavalry swept across the open plain, spreading out in wide arcs that gradually sealed every possible avenue of retreat. The Hungarian army had entered the battle believing the river protected them. Now the river stood behind them, and the enemy was everywhere. At the center of the Hungarian position stood King Béla IV and the royal command. The king's immediate priority was to reorganize the army before the Mongols could exploit their encirclement. Messengers rode between different contingents of the army, attempting to coordinate counterattacks. But communication was already breaking down. The Hungarian army had assembled from many different regions of the kingdom. Each noble commanded his own retinue of knights and soldiers. Coordination between these forces depended on fast communication and shared understanding of the battlefield. Neither existed anymore. The Mongol attack had unfolded in several directions at once. Dust from thousands of horses filled the air across the plain. Arrows rained in long, disciplined volleys from mounted archers who rarely closed directly with their opponents. Units of Mongol cavalry appeared briefly, fired into dense Hungarian formations, then disappeared again into the expanding circle. To many Hungarian soldiers, it seemed as though the enemy was everywhere at once. The wagon camp that had once seemed like a defensive advantage now began to reveal its weaknesses. Inside the enclosure, thousands of soldiers, horses, and supply carts crowded into limited space. Movement became increasingly difficult. Knights attempting to mount countercharges found narrow passages clogged with infantry and wagons. Commanders trying to move reinforcements toward threatened areas discovered that the camp itself had become an obstacle. Meanwhile, the Mongols continued tightening their grip. Rather than launching a reckless assault, Subutai allowed the Hungarian army to compress itself. Mounted archers rode along the perimeter of the encirclement, maintaining distance while releasing wave after wave of arrows into the packed defenders. Every movement inside the camp became visible from the outside. Every attempt to reorganize created new confusion. The Mongols were not simply attacking the Hungarian army. They were controlling the pace of its collapse. At some point during the morning, the Hungarian leadership recognized the danger of remaining trapped inside the camp. A decision was made to attempt a breakout. If the army could punch through one section of the Mongol encirclement, it might escape into the open plains where the knights could regroup and fight on more favorable terms. The chosen direction was westward. A large force of Hungarian knights assembled near one section of the wagon line. Infantry began pulling carts aside to create a temporary opening. The moment required coordination and speed. For a brief time, it seemed possible. The knights surged forward through the gap, forming a powerful column of armored cavalry. Their horses accelerated across the plain as they charged toward what appeared to be a thinner section of the Mongol line. But what looked like weakness was carefully designed. Subutai had left a controlled opening in the encirclement, a gap that appeared large enough to escape through. In reality, it was a funnel. As Hungarian cavalry pushed through the opening, Mongol horse archers on either side began to close in behind them. Arrows struck horses and riders from multiple directions. Units that had ridden forward in a tight formation began to scatter under the constant fire. Behind them, the gap in the Mongol line slowly closed. The Hungarian army had not escaped. It had simply moved into another trap. This was a tactic the Mongols had perfected over generations of warfare across the steppe. Allow the enemy to believe they have found a path to safety, then surround them again once they commit to the escape. Across the battlefield at Mohi, Hungarian soldiers now face attacks from every direction. Inside the wagon camp, panic began to spread. Without a clear path of retreat, cohesion inside the Hungarian army started to dissolve. Groups of soldiers attempted to flee individually. Knights who had lost their horses struggled to move through the chaos. Infantry formations broke apart as men attempted to escape the relentless arrow fire. The Mongol cavalry now began moving closer. Where earlier they had maintained distance, they now pressed inward, tightening the ring around the disorganized defenders. Close combat erupted across multiple parts of the battlefield. Hungarian knights fought fiercely, their heavy armor giving them an advantage in direct encounters. But these engagements were brief and isolated. Mongol units rarely allowed themselves to be fixed in prolonged melee. Instead, they struck quickly and withdrew, allowing other units to continue the harassment. The Hungarian army was slowly being dismantled piece by piece. King Béla IV eventually realized the battle could no longer be salvaged. Survival of the kingdom now depended on preserving the monarchy itself. With a small group of loyal knights, Béla attempted to escape the battlefield. fighting through scattered Mongol units. The king managed to break away from the collapsing army and flee westward. His escape would prove crucial for Hungary's future, but the army he left behind was already disintegrating. By the afternoon of April 11th, organized resistance at Mohi had effectively ended. Thousands of Hungarian soldiers lay dead across the plain. Many others were cut down during desperate attempts to flee the battlefield. The Mongol encirclement had worked exactly as intended. What had begun as a confident defensive position along the river had transformed into one of the most devastating defeats in Hungarian history. The destruction of the Hungarian army opened the heart of the kingdom to invasion. With no major force left to resist them, Mongol armies spread across Hungary during the months that followed. Cities were burned. Villages were abandoned. Entire regions were depopulated as survivors fled westward or hid within forests and marshlands. The Mongol campaign in Hungary demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of their operational strategy. Victory at Mohi had not been the result of a single powerful charge or a dramatic turning point. It had been constructed carefully through reconnaissance, engineering, deception, and precise timing. The river crossing, the flanking maneuver, the controlled encirclement, each element had been prepared before the battle even began. Subutai had shaped the battlefield long before the Hungarian army realized it.